Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's lecture that is jointly organized by the Asia Research Institute at the NUS and the Asian Civilization Museum. We jointly organize about 4 public lectures per academic year. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Asian Civilization Museum, which is part of the National Heritage Board of Singapore. So let me, by the way, I'm dropping what I will be chairing this evening's seminar, this evening's lecture. And rightly, Professor Prasenjit Dwara, who is the director of the Asia Research Institute, should be here to give a few words of some introduction to the Asia Research Institute for those of you who are unfamiliar with us. But in any case, since I have to introduce the speaker anyway, we collapse the responsibility onto me. The Asia Research Institute is probably the only research institute in Singapore that is not a think tank. And it is very important to us that it is not a think tank, because it is a place where we're truly privileged to just do academic research without any obligation of having to report on the conditions of the countries in which we study, We also do not have to produce position or policy papers that might be advised, advisory to the government. Where we are, in fact, all the research fellows in the institute are engaged in full-time research work, with a few of us who also teach concurrently at the National University of Singapore. And the research work, there is probably around 35 to 40 full-time research fellows at RE at any one time, with different length of tenure between 3 months to 2 years to 4 years, depending on where they are in their career and depending on how much time they get to spend away from their jobs to be visiting fellows with us. We have 6 different research focus, or what we call research cluster. They include cultural studies in Asia, which is the cluster that is responsible for this evening's lecture, Asian migration, religion and globalization, changing family structure, Asian urbanism, and at the most abstract and theoretical level, something called meta-theoretical research cluster. And also, in the event there are still people who, very interesting people who fall out of these clusters, we still catch them in what we call the open cluster. So you can imagine that the place is an extremely intellectual activity intense space. We organize at least 1, more often 2 seminars, 2 workshops or international conferences a month. So it adds up to about almost 30 conferences and workshops. In addition to that, we have this particular lecture series and some other events in which it's part of our public outreach program. So for this evening, we have Associate Professor ChengYinghong, who is now a visiting research fellow at the Asia Research Institute. He is an associate professor at the University of Delaware in the Asian History Department. Originally from China, he's been in the U.S. teaching. Received his PhD from Northeastern University in 2001, and has been teaching in the U.S. since. His publication includes the Creating the New Man, From Enlightenment Ideas to Socialist Realities. In the current context, this is part of the lecture for tonight is part of his ongoing research, and his other ongoing research project is on popular culture and nationalism in China. For tonight's lecture on the decline and revival of Chinatown in Havana, 1959 to 2000, Professor Chen had visited Cuba not too long before he came to Singapore, so the information is still very fresh, and you should have been well informed about the place by the end of this evening. Professor Chen, please.
Well, good evening, everyone, and special thanks to Asian Civilization Museum and RE&US for generous support of this event, which allowed me to share my data and some of my thinking about the decline and the revival of the Chinatown in Havana from 1959 to 2000. I choose this period because the pre-1959 history has been quite well covered by many historians, well published in form of monographs and journal articles. But as far as I know, nobody has done anything seriously about the post-1959, simply because the difficulty of the access to the data. Okay, but it was the post-1959 development was very outstanding phenomena because Havana's Chinatown used to be the largest one in Latin America and the second only to the ones in San Francisco or New York. So you can imagine the magnificence. But after 1959, it drastically declined. So what caused that decline? And of course, we know that Cuba has been a socialist and a communist society system that goes against privately owned property. So we have no problem understanding that. But exactly what happened, that has intrigued me. I am a historian of Chinese Revolution in the context of World Revolution, and my PhD dissertation explores some similarities between the Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, and the Cuban Revolution. So, and then a couple of years ago, I came to where I was working on a project to talk about the China's impact in terms of economic reforms on the Cuban politics. I mean, China set up itself as an example of economic development by adopting the policies of reforms and openness. So that certainly had some impact on the Cuban leadership. So when I was doing that project, I was exposed to some materials about the Chinese Cubans. So I became aware the scale and the magnificence of the Chinese community before 1959. Then so that is how I developed my interest in this project. Now, decline means, let me explain this title a little bit first. Decline means, first, it means demographic decline. Around in 1961, after the first wave of the exile, you still had like around 10,000 Chinese in Havana, but today a little bit more than 200. So, and the whole economy was gone, and the awareness of Chinese ethnicity is basically gone. Okay, and the Chinatown is resided basically by non-ethnic Chinese. So that's the decline. Revival means since the mid-1990s, there have been a Cuban government-sponsored efforts trying to revitalize Chinatown. For basically, it was especially in the beginning, it was politically motivated. I will explain that later. Okay, but so far the revitalization is still very much limited. There is no comparison between today's revitalization and the Chinatown before 1959. Okay, so in this lecture, I will try to talk less, but show you more of those materials. It goes like a slideshow. Very much like a documentary. I will off and on step in, explain something, interpret something necessary, without a heavily concentrated interpretation or analysis. I do that because reason number one, basically because I have selected these images, organize them, characterize them, divided them into 4 parts. So I think the process already shows my thinking and my interpretation of the history. And I just would like to use this occasion to share with you as much primary source as possible. But we can talk about the things after the presentation. Now, here, special thanks to these people, acknowledgement. The first two, Garcia and N, they are 2 independent historians in Havana. I interviewed them, and they helped me a lot. Actually, I just want to use this occasion to publicize their work in preserving and researching that history. And then the Chinese community, Casino Chonghua and Jose Chao Chu, and the newspaper, and Dr. Gregor Benton, he's a known British Chinese historian. He introduced me to these 2 gentlemen, and I will talk about that later. And I should thank my home institution. Now, we should have some basic background knowledge, so I put this chronology first, Chinese in Cuba. Starting from 1847, I explained the historical background here. The Chinese indentured laborers were brought to Cuba, where everybody understood that the slavery is coming to an end very soon, and they need, workers to take over the positions left, conceivably left over by black slaves. Okay, then 1860s, 1890s, Chinese joined Cuba's independence wars. Those are Chinese who were so upset with those indentured labor, so they ran away. They joined the guerrilla warfare. And then 1870s to 1950s. That was a time that Chinatown developed into the largest one in Latin America. And then Chinese joined the Fidel Castro's armed struggle. And then after the revolution, you have 2 waves of nationalization of privately owned properties, the biggest banks, as small as street vendors. Then the Chinatown drastically decays, and the socio-economic and the cultural and ethnic kind of consequences of that. Then 1990s and the 2010s, Chinatown slowly revives as China and Cuba resumed their comradeship in the post-Cold War. So a key development at the time was Fidel Castro openly endorsed Beijing's crackdown of pro-democracy movement in 1989. So Fidel Castro was one of very few world leaders who openly sided with Beijing at that particular moment. So certainly that impressed Chinese leadership. So you have all of those following development. Okay, so that is chronology, a timeline. So I have a lecture outline here. I divided into 4 parts. I will go like 50 minutes or so. In the first part, I introduced these 2 gentlemen, these 2 independent historians. And then part 2, I will show you lots of images about exactly how the Chinatown in Havana looked like before 1959. And then I will explain what happened after 1959. And then I will show you how Chinatown today. Okay, so here we have Garcia and N. N is half Chinese. In Chinese, his N is Wu. That's his family name, Wu. Like Dongwu, Wu. So they were 2 revolutionary veterans, but in the late time of their life, they turned to be historians. I will explain that. The focal point in the first part is I try to explain why they are devoted to the history of Chinese in Cuba. Okay, Greco-Bendon is a very admirable scholar. He's a known historian, and he came to these 2 gentlemen, and he worked very hard to select, edit, and translate some of their essays, articles into English, and managed to publish that very recently. And I wrote a book review for that book. And Greco-Bendon introduced me to these 2 gentlemen. So now, first, N. So his father was a owner of a small business, and he was also intellectual, a journalist. And he married a white woman. So here you see N joined the revolution in 1959. He organized the Chinese militia to take over Chinatown because Fidel Castro's people had a very little idea about the particular community. So here you see N here, okay, but later he kind of converted to Buddhism. Now he is here. So you see on the face and the body they are crossed. So that tells you a little bit about the history of the Cuban Revolution, because Fidel Castro claimed his revolution to be just a nationalist and democratic. But after 1959, there was more and more evidence suggesting that his revolution was turning more left, so to socialist or communist. So, but the revolution was basically a united front kind of politics. So the people who were just liberals or Democrats, they began to develop hostility against those more leftist-looking people. So they suspect N was a socialist or even communist. So they put crosses on his body and face, a kind of practice you can see in China's Cultural Revolution. But now he is a Buddhist. Okay, so here is a palm tree. Okay, so above the palm tree you see the water lily and the Buddha. So that suggests that this is Buddhism in the Caribbean. And now he's also an artist. His style is close to kind of primitivism kind of style. Okay, they use rough lines and strong colors. Okay, now, so here is a document of his revolutionary history. And here is the comradeship. I also interviewed this person. Not necessarily interviewed, I met him. And we talked, and I visited the newspaper's factory. Okay, now, so that shows you the Chinese militia taking over Chinatown's nationalist office, okay, Kuomintang's office, that happened in October 1960. when Fidel Castro engaged in large-scale nationalization. Here, in terms outside of his house, a display of the Chinese contribution to the Cuban independence and the revolution. His idea is both the independence and the revolution was a very much internationalist engagement. So here, under Che Guevara's commander, there were many Chinese guerrilla fighters. So he was trying to, sending out the message about the idea is basically Chinese is not foreigner. They are not foreigner. They are part of the Cuban nationhood. I will explain that later. Now, he's also an artist. So here, let me just read the my lines. The lines I wrote here. He basically decorates his home with images of Chinese contribution to the independence and the revolution. Here is the Chinese hero in the independence, in the war for the independence. Here is Jose Marti and his praise of Chinese contribution to Cuban independence. This is a wooden piece. He ironed Jose Marti's image, and he's saying here, and is another one is Confucius. Here are some maps he made about the home provinces of Chinese Cubans back in China, and these two. This one is Havana Bay. This one is the neighborhood of the Chinatown. Now here's another person, Garcia. In Spanish, I guess if you have three parts for their name, then basically the first one is the first name, the second one is the father's name, the third one is the mother's name. So I just go with the father's name here. So he is legendary figure in the Cuban Revolution in a way. He took a big risk joining Fidel Castro underground movement. And he had a magnificent diplomatic career after the revolution, trying to disseminate revolutionary messages, especially in Latin America. And then he went to Vietnam, he went to China, and he went to East Germany. So I'm going to show some of here with Castro again. Here's, I guess, after the Bay of the Pigs. I mean, I think that's him. Okay, that's him. So he was very close to the North Vietnamese leaders. Here is his first son. And here you can recognize this is Phan Binh Thong, the Vietnamese premier, and this is Nguyen Gia, the defense minister. And here he's in China with Zhou Enlai and Chen Yi, China's premier and foreign minister. I think you can see this photo. That is available, but not this one. So he was in China. He witnessed the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and actually the reason he was dispatched to China because there was a big trouble in the Cuban embassy in Beijing. I think some of us familiar with the term 造反派, the rebels. So the Chinese employees in Cuban embassy, they rebel against the ambassador. That created a big mess. So, so the Cuban government dispatched him to clean up things, and so he stayed at the chat affair for 3 or 4 years. And he was even involved in, unwittingly involved in the Chinese Cultural Revolution politics. Actually, I came to know his name several years ago when I was reading Mao's anthologies, and when I was reading some diplomats' memoirs, I came to know the name Garcia. I was impressed by that, but I never, thought I would be able to meet him. So here, I think in this part of the world, many of us recognize this person, especially with his reputation here. And here, so this person, I think he was the Peruvian leader between 68 to 75, Velasco. He was the left-wing nationalist leader, and during his governance, he nationalized most of those Western capitals, including the Chinese one. The Chinatown in Lima significantly weakened by those policies. Many Chinese choose left. Okay, now here is he is in Eastern Germany. Here is you have Honecker here. He was in power between the time he became the ambassador and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And here you have Kim Il-sung and Garcia is here. Now I took this photo in his home. Now he's a very very humble but very diligent scholar. Okay. His home is just so simple. Okay, it reminds me of the Chinese average household in the 1970s. Okay, so he gave me a CD which has like 250 photos. The majority about the Chinese-Cuban history, about the 40 or something look like the things I just showed to you about his diplomatic career. Now, that is the book in Spanish he wrote, and he published that. Now, why I say that is an unrewarding job, because I think he paid his own money to get these 2 volumes to be published. And now, we have 2 revolutionary veterans. Why are they devoted to the history of Chinese in Cuba? I think so that is the first question I asked them when I first met them. So their answer is, I think their answer is for the historical justice. What that means is Chinese contributed so much to the independence, the revolution, the Republican politics, and the Chinese leftists involved in the Cuban, unionist movement and the Cuban communist movement. They also supported Fidel Castro's revolution. And then after the revolution, basically within several years, the Chinese disappeared from the Cuban national narrative, history narrative. So basically for political reasons. So they just felt like obligated to reconstruct or to restore this type of history. And I think both of them personally, connect to China a lot. Okay. Now, this is the image on the wall of Garcia's home. I took this image, and which is a gift by N. N is an artist, so he drew this image. So I told Garcia, I said I was very touched by the ideas behind this image. So my idea is basically when they approached very senior age, they realized that nationality, identity, all of these things don't matter a lot. You are human. So in that way, the entire world is your, and humanity is your where you should associate with or belong. Now, part 2, Chinese in Cuba before 1959. So I'm going to show a number of photos. Now, first, the old Chinatown in N's memory, because he is an artist. So he portrayed the old Chinatown. In that way, he reconstructs history. I took this photo. Oh, another thing about the source. Okay, if you see this date, that means I took the photo. Okay, otherwise, basically, everything belongs to them. Okay. Okay, so here is a magnificent picture created not long ago. And I explained the background of this. So that is a ceremonial thing in 1954, okay, for a opening ceremony of a big building in Chinatown. And now some details. Okay, some details on this picture. So you see theater, you see musical club, you see drugstore, you see offices of a number of Chinese associations, etc. And you see, the nationalist China's, 2 ROCs, okay, flags displayed here. And here you have a Buddhist monk joining the celebration. And here I mean, this is another image. Okay, here is another image describing Chinese cemetery and a parade room. Okay, I will show you more photos about that cemetery. So here is the gate of the Chinese cemetery. Now, here are some interesting details. All of these are everyday stuff. Okay, grinder stones and a scale here. Okay, so which tells you the degree of the sentimental attachment in developed, okay, to the so-called old Havana. And the color he used is so bright. Okay, so I was just overwhelmed by his style, and I think it suggests what really in his mind about the Cuba before the 1959 revolution, although he joined the revolution. Okay. Now, photos of a pre-revolutionary Chinese community collected and provided by N and Garcia. Now, first, Chinese-Cuban nationalism. That is my understanding. That means, I think, national identity is a very fluid concept. It's subject to the changing circumstances. I think Dr. Dura has some analysis on that. But anyway, in this case, I think the Chinese in Cuba develop a kind of dual kind of identity. On the one hand, they are Chinese by their passport, by their origin. On the other hand, they are also Cubans, because their history is so, deeply embedded in the development of Cuban nationalism and the nation building. Okay, so in this case, they have two nations to identify with, or to identify with. So as long as these two nations, there's a harmony between, and that was true up to the mid-1960s, and starting from 1960s and up to the very late 1980s, they were confused because China and Cuba become the enemy. Okay. Now here you have images of some Cuban Cuban fighters. Okay, in the fighting for the independence. Okay, and they were praised later after the independence. And here you have two patriarchs look-alike person, but they were when they were young, they were energetic, devoted guerrilla fighters. Okay, but when they grew old, they become a kind of very much paternalistic and patriarchal person. Okay. Now here you have Jose Marti's image and Sun Yat-sen and the flags of two republics. Okay, so I think that clearly tells you clearly about their understanding of identity. Now here you have the opening ceremony of the monument for the Chinese contribution to the independence. Okay, the Cuban government supported that, and the Chinese community had some fundraising things, and then they established that. Okay. The thing was done in 1931, which was a better time. The Japanese invaded China, so they didn't feel it's the right time to celebrate. So they postponed that until 15 years later, okay, when China won the war. Okay, so you see the Cuban president was at the ceremony. Okay, so it tells you a lot about the respect the Chinese Cubans enjoyed at the time. Okay. Now, the Chinese nationalism also reflected in those those supports they offered to China during the war against the Japanese. They purchased the war bonds, and they sent back their kids to join the nationalist army. Okay, N's elder brother back to China, but unfortunately they were still capable of keeping correspondence even into the 1950s, but into 1960s they lost touch, and ever since, I think, at least by the time I was there. So here is the China's Navy visits Havana in 1946. So the Chinese in Cuba took that opportunity to inaugurate to have the opening ceremony for the monument. Okay. So here is the military review parade, and here by the soldiers, by the sailors, and here are Chinese students and their professors. They dressed up, so they are welcoming the Chinese Navy. Now, vibrant economy, that is another aspect of the community life. So you have the bank there. The bank was established during the war, early 1940s, I think. Because there were great demand of remittance back to China. And also here, I got confused which one is the grocery, which one is the, drugstore. But anyway, I think the point is remittance back to China and the Chinese traditional medicine. These are two most important businesses that connect Chinese Cubans, okay, to China. Okay, they need to send money back to support their family, especially those low class people, because they don't establish their household in Cuba, so they are obligated. Okay, for the up and middle class people, many of them, I think, they established families, but they are still obligated. Okay. And the traditional medicine, because most of them are Cantonese, so they just believe traditional medicine so much as we know. So, okay, I will go back to these things later. Okay, now, well-organized and autonomous community. Okay, I believe where I can use the term civil society to describe that. Here you have 7 associations. Okay, based on clan or your home county back in China. And one based on ideology, that is called Cuban Chinese Socialist Alliance. They are basically pro-communist. Some of them were actually, I think, communist. So above all of these associations, you have a federal, confederal framework, okay, democratically elected and organized. Okay, dealing with the municipal politics representing Chinese community. So you see they are all well dressed, but actually this one, I think, is the meeting of laundry owners, not necessarily, rich people. Okay. Here you have the meeting record. Okay. These are all photos I took. That was the one in 1958, immediately before the revolution. Now, one thing important is many of those associations recognize some famous persons in the Cuban independence as the founding figures of their associations. So that is the way they identify themselves with the Cuban nationhood. That is the way to say that we are not foreigners, we are part of the nation from the beginning. Okay. Now, rich cultural and identity presentations, that's a cultural issue. Now, you have kindergarten here, you have middle school, and they are displaying 2, national flags here. And here you even have the beauty contest. So you see all girls here, there is a number, okay, attached to them. And some of them later turn to be a, cultural star. For example, the Kwang Meilan. You see her name is Meilan here. Her number is 23. And martial arts and Taekwondo and Taekwondo, a Korean, originated martial art. You see lots of mixed racial people here, and that is true. And when I was in Havana, I observed I think there's only one Chinese martial arts group. Okay, overwhelmingly non-Chinese. Okay, so now these Chinese opera themes, and this another opera themes, and there's another one. So Chinese music club and the Chinese theater. Also you see lots of mixed race kids here. So certainly I think most of them belong to the middle or even upper class family. Now here is a golden eagle. The interesting thing is I don't recall I saw anything that is named after dragon or something. No, dragon as a ethnic cultural symbol, I think very much recent cultural phenomenon. Now, cultural multicolor carnival. Carnival is a typical Latin American mass culture presentation. So Chinese in Cuba had a place there. So here is the lion dance band, which is just one of those lion dance band at the time. Okay. Now, more cultural things. Here is a newspaper. Okay, 光华报. 光华报 is, means, bright, light, and China, the newspaper, something like that. So in this factory, this is just one corner of the factory. You see at least four people working there. And at that time, there are at least 4 newspapers, all in Chinese, not in Spanish. Here is another newspaper. Okay, 开民公报, that which is, the previous one was more pro-communist. This one is more pro-nationalist. Now, religion and spirituality. So here you see ancestor veneration rituals in a Chinese cemetery, and here is shrine and prayer. Chinese had their own graveyards simply in the beginning because the Spaniards did not allow Chinese to bury their people in the common cemetery. So the Chinese had to build up their own, but it turned out to be a magnificent Chinese cultural display place. Okay, display place. Now here is the religious syncretism, one example of Buddhism with Christianity. The female figure here, combining Virgin Mary and Guan Yin, the Buddha is the mercy goddess. I took this photo when Garcia and Anne brought me in. We waited for a while until we saw somebody else taking pictures. So they said, you may take a picture. It is not rare for this picture in Southeast Asia or in China, but it's kind of rare in Havana. But the most important thing is this picture is displayed in a major Catholic church in Havana, and the church is built in the Chinatown, not outside. Okay, so here is outside of the church. Now Jesus Christ image here. That Chinese painting just on this side of the wall. Okay, just on this side of the wall. They are in the same room. Okay. Now here is the Guan Yin worship. Guan Yu worship. Okay, so this image is a part of the bigger image I showed to you a little bit earlier. Okay. So here is some tombs in Chinese cemetery built before 1959. Many of them are big, like a house even. Okay. And now here shows you some Spanish influence in their burial kind of style. Here is the Spanish cemetery, very close to the Chinese cemetery. So the Spanish, their graveyard, their tombs are above the ground. So some Chinese, they followed. Here is Garcia. And this one, I think, on the list of, this Spanish graveyard is on the list of UNESCO's World Heritage. Now, interracial marriage and the middle upper class families. I think that's important. We saw an image photo earlier, which shows you a Chinese music band. Okay, you see lots of interracial girls there. I think obviously they look like upper or at least upper middle class people, and they because they had a household there. Okay, so they had deeper roots in the community. And the low class people, they don't have family there. Their family back in China. Okay, so they send the money back to maintain these relationships of household. As a community together, okay, as a whole, you have a not just developed, but stratified and specialized, a very diverse structure. You have all type of people. Okay, and after the revolution, these people bore the brunt of the revolution. So after they departed or after they were gone, basically you no longer have a sound socio-economic foundation for the whole community there. Now, political diversity, communists versus nationalists. So here you have communists. Here the Huang Taobai. He got a Spanish name. And all of these are communist people, and he was. Well, the story is the Chinese leftist workers and the intellectuals were very active in Cuba. And in the mid-1920s, as we know, there was a united front between communists and the nationalists back in China, which was very, effective. And the Cuban communists kind of got inspired by this kind of strategy. So they approached the Chinese leftists. So he was deeply involved in the Cuban communist movement. And interestingly, after Chiang Kai-shek put down the communists, okay, in the mid-1927, he was executed along with some Cuban communists. But afterwards, there wasn't any. The communist movement in Cuba went underground a little bit, and after the end of World War II, they returned. So here are the nationalists. So obviously, if you compare these two, people on the left side, they look more like intellectuals and workers. If the people on these sides were like, businessmen. Okay. And I think it is true, not just in Cuba. Okay. Now here again, you have, nationalists versus. So the nationalists, the Kuomintang, they have well-developed network in Havana. Here is the third party branch in Havana. Okay. He's the leader of the third. So you can imagine. But here you have pro-communist newspaper. Okay, as long as Cuba had a constitutional democracy before Batista took over, basically it's fine for pro-communists to come up. So the title of editorial is "Under the Kuomintang one-party dictatorship, China can never be unified." Okay, so I'm not sure if that argument is still valuable today. In terms of the mainland, not Taiwan. Okay. Now here, it looks like even in the underworld, the two of them still cannot get along with each other. So you have Kuomintang term here, you have pro-communist term here. Now the interesting is, during the Cultural Revolution, there were also radical people in the community of Chinese in Cuba. So they went around when they saw some symbols representing like a Kuomintang, so they just vandalized it. And on the top of these columns, there used to be a emblem of Nationalist Party, so they took that away. Okay, now what happened after the revolution? Basically, we have the idea of nationalization. People in Miami, there were some Chinese Cuban descent. They would tell you the story, like the government people came, they give you notice, like we give you 1 week, and 1 week from now you clean up your business, your house, leave everything intact, and then you get your car, get your keys ready. Then we will come. We take your keys and you leave. Basically, you may bring some cash. That's all, little bit of cash. Okay, you just leave. Now, I'm more interested in how that happened to Chinese community, but unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any specific evidence of that. Simply because the lack of a systematic preservation of newspapers and everything, I wasn't able to. I was basically the first one to read some newspapers. Okay. But the earliest newspaper, the time was 1968. Okay, the second wave of nationalization. I didn't see anything earlier. They told me that's all, nothing earlier. But there were some community notices, community flyers. I would be able to show that to you. Okay, which will give us some idea about how nationalization affected, or how the revolution in general affected the community. Changes in the community demographics. Now, this survey took place in 1962. Okay, I mean that's the end of the time. Okay, so you can see the demographic figures. So I would assume that happened. I mean the figures here shows the upper and middle class people are missing. Okay, of course they left. Okay, otherwise we would be able to see more women and more kids. Okay, and only 13% established family in Cuba. Okay. Now here is occupations. So basically they are low class, physical labor kind of occupation. Okay. And here is the list of the last names, 134 in total. Okay, very, inclusive. Okay. And here is their home counties back in China, overwhelmingly Cantonese. And here is the age cohort. So you can see the seniors, they were majority. Okay, right. Community in hard time. Okay. Now, this is an interesting piece. I took like 10 photos of this little pamphlet. Okay, it explained why this type of publication is necessary, because they say we are short of money, short of paper. We have to reduce the size of our newspaper, and for that reason, we still want to get the news or something important across the community. So we have to, to have a cheaper form of notification. So that is why we have this mimeograph pamphlet. Okay, so that and also it says what is urgent now is the government is asking us to conduct a population survey every 3 months nationwide. Okay, so we do need to do, fulfill these kind of, legal obligation. So we need to, this type of publication or communication. Okay, so this is another example of the government interference into economy, which created more difficult for the Chinese, even small business people, to hand in your cash to the state bank. Okay, not to let them, keep it in your home overnight. So this part continues the last one. Okay, and this part is the beginning of another appeal, okay, which asked the Chinese to join the Cuban volunteers to form kind of brigade to go to state farms. Cuba began to face the deficiencies of everyday consumer goods right after the nationalization, okay, 1961. And ever since that, the basic items of your everyday necessity, like even sugar is, in the 1980s or 1990s, sugar is included, okay. But certainly meat, eggs, and flour, these match, so all of these things are rationed, okay. So here is the Chinese community responded to the government's call, okay, to join the nationwide movement. Here is this is a community notice which says every 3 months that is the routine for our to report to conduct a population survey. So here is the locations in provinces. I think even there is only a couple of Chinese Cubans, you got to have these kind of rally point, okay, to get the information. Now, life with deficiency, which means everything is rationed and everything comes with a quota. Okay. Now here are two pieces of newspapers. This one is about remittance to China. Now the point is the Cuban, before the revolution there was no limit on your remittance to China. After the revolution, the government controls money. Okay, so it controls the foreign currency or whatever. So it gives every Chinese an annual quota for your remittance. Normally, if you have wife or parents or kids in China, you have 250. You have brothers, sisters, 200. Okay. So on and so forth. So when you die, except your relatives, your direct relatives, okay, anybody else cannot take the money, the remaining balance in the bank. The government takes over. Okay. So that's one thing. Okay, really give the Chinese a very hard time. I think the money they saved basically before the revolution. Okay, after the revolution, many of them their property were gone, and then they were given like 40 pesos a month, which is barely, to maintain their daily life. No more saving. Okay, so conceivably, the money were the ones they saved before the revolution, and it's still in the bank. Now here is the food rate. Now Chinese traditional medicine, it's now also come with quota and rationed. Okay, you have to belong, organized into groups. Okay, to take the quota. Okay, this month is for you, next month is for me. Okay, it doesn't matter your medical needs. Okay. Now here is I interviewed this gentleman, Huang Zuocai. He is a professor in Guangzhou, a Chinese language professor in Guangzhou. His father came to Cuba in 1930s, after he was born. Okay, and was never able to come back, but he maintained very regular communication with his family, and routinely he sent money back to China. But after the revolution, it's become very difficult. In this letter, he explained the situation. He says, now I got 40 pesos a month, and annually I am allowed only to send back 250 pesos. Okay, although your mother is in China and you are in China, but that's just exactly how much I can mail it back. And later on, he wanted to go back to China, which was very difficult. Okay, in this letter, he also explains that the Cuban government, in terms of policy, it allowed Chinese people to go back to China, but in practice, they made it very difficult. I read the book, and I also read some letters. Huang Zuocai was not able to publish all of these letters. Okay, something you have to think about in terms of the Chinese-Cuban relations. Okay, so anyway, so I was able to interview him and get this type of information. Okay, to compare with what I collected in Cuba. Okay. Now here is efforts. Now how the community somehow survived. Okay, even at a very low scale. Okay, they still survived. I was able to find, these kind of things scattered in a library. There is not a systematic preservation. Okay, they just store things there, pile up things there, and many newspapers are in such a bad condition. Okay, many pages are just completely rotten, very fragile. But fortunately, I was able to find several of those books of those community association meeting records, which shows you how they made that. Now, I think that what they did is they negotiated with Cuban government, okay, on the issues of remittance, for example, medicine, and that's one thing. Another thing is they maintained the association buildings, and they trying to maintain a nursery for senior people. But two things are most important. One is they try to maintain a democratic framework of the community. So this is one example, okay, and especially the Confederate organization, okay, Cuban Chinese Havana Association. So that one was still functioning, at least in terms of the regular meetings, elections. Okay, so here is attendance and agenda. I took perhaps 70s or 80 photos of those records, trying to find out what they were really discussing. And what's on the agenda? Basically are welfare issues. Okay, how to take care of the senior people, and how to celebrate some holidays, and how to hold elections for the next, boards of executive members, and whether or not we should have a new window on the west walls of our community, of our building, these kind of things. And something like the Chinese embassy is going to give us a used car and sometimes a used refrigerator, which is good, but we should send somebody, a couple people to the embassy to make sure it won't cost us a lot in terms of fixing that. So, normally it goes like one person proposed that, and the second, and then you see the discussion, and they won't make a decision in that meeting. The next meeting they will come back. So I think it is this kind of democracy and the transparency that helps to hold the community together. Otherwise, you have 7 different associations. Okay, and during the Cultural Revolution, there was a very much violent factionalism. Okay, now the Chinatown today. Okay, that is the last part. Okay, so this is inside and outside. Okay, and there is basically more inside. And here you have the signs of these buildings, which tells you before, okay, what the uses of this building. And here is the newspaper. Guanghua Bao, I was brought in by En and Garcia, so they are the friends of the editorial staff. Actually, only two older men there, so they turned the lights on. So that is the only Chinese newspaper today still using movable type printing. They don't have computer there. Okay, so that's how they work with. And you don't have that many people. I think just 2 or 3 people. Okay, on one photo I showed you before, at one corner you see at least 4 people. So that particular issue of newspaper had been there for almost 2 months. Okay, and that printer was made in the U.S., donated by Chinese Americans. Okay, 100 years ago. And the interesting thing is some antique collectors offered a purchase, but they rejected. So here is basically the entire newspaper staff. No young people working there. Okay. I think 联合早报 Singapore 联合早报 had a coverage sometime a little bit earlier than the time I was there. Okay, about this newspaper. Okay, here is how currently the newspaper look like. Okay, very irregularly, and the printing quality is so low. You know, after a month, many parts of the newspaper just unreadable. Okay, I mean the newspaper I show you, which coming out in 1945, still you can read that without any problem. Now here a corner of today's Chinese cemetery. Okay. So you see they planted trees, they nationalized that, but they did not maintain that, so somebody can implant a tree, and then the roots of the tree damaged those the foundations of those tombs. Okay, now the Cuban government efforts to revitalize Chinatown since the 1990s. I introduced the background a little before. Now, the important thing is the preferential policies towards Chinese in Cuba. What does that mean? That means because of the significant economic difficulties, so the Cuban government tried, okay, to implement some economic reform policies borrowed from China and encouraged by Chinese. And they choose a particular ethnic group, Chinese, to allow them, to give them more freedom, okay, to be a little bit more capitalist. Okay, now I think the Chinese have been included in the national narrative since the 1990s. Not just for international political reasons, okay, to please China, but also because there has been a very genuine recognition of the value of multiculturalism. What happened in the early stage of the Cuban Revolution is there was a very utopian idea to create a classless and race-blind Cubanidad, which means a new Cuban people. Okay. And for that, I think Chinese ethnicity is sacrificed because in terms of demographic figures, there were like 6 million, okay, in total population. The Chinese, just 10,000. So 1/600, right? So that's tiny, okay. It will easily dissolve in the ocean like a drop of water. So if you do that, if you destroy the socio-economic foundation, the whole community and the consciousness and the feasibility of the ethnicity will easily disappear. Okay. Now, but afterwards, into the 1990s, I think for various reasons, the government began to encourage the display of multiculturalism, and in this case, the Chineseness. Okay. Now, economically, so it seems like, I think what I'm saying is, it seems like the Chinese has been absorbed into the national historical narrative. But now the socio-economic policy is preferential, which is good. Okay, but on the other hand, I think it's also an effort to limit the economic reform. Fidel Castro has been always suspicious of the future of the doubtful, of the future of economic reforms. So it is very convenient, okay, if you want to turn over the policy, okay. So the Chinese would choose to become capitalist again, which just means you can operate a restaurant or a small business outside your household. And you can hire helping hands beyond your family members. For the Cubans, you are not allowed to do that. Okay, they are allowed to run a restaurant as long as you stay in your home kitchen. Everything else is run by the government. So the government even established office, invest some money. Okay, but it's highly concentrated in a small portion of Chinatown. Okay, and very much performative, like some I will show you some cultural performance later. Now here is, I mean, from the perspective of professional historians, I believe this one is very important. Okay, this is the place in 1847 the first Chinese indentured slaves were brought here. Okay, and they stay inside and they were sold. Okay, it looks like warehouse. Okay, it's a very important place. But what do they do to this place? They only put this plaque on the wall, nothing else. Okay, to commemorate the 100th anniversary. I mean, you have this warehouse there. Just do a little bit of work to fix everything and make the inside a good museum. Okay, but it seems, they're just not interested in that. Now here is interesting stuff. These gentlemen, here we have this book, okay, published by Pathfinder in New York. The editor interviewed 3 Chinese descent Cuban generals, and they published the book. So by the title, you can see it is a response to the so-called the end of history discourse. So, and the book is, I wrote a book review on this. My idea is the revolutionary rhetoric that is filled in this book does not offer us lots of valuable information, but it does offer us some insights from this person. He's one of the 3 generals. Okay, he passed away. He was Raul Castro's secretary, very close to the Raul Castro's inner circle, and Raul has a reputation of being a reformist ever since, I think, the mid-1960s even. Under Raul's endorsement, he was in charge of the Army's reserve. So he initiated some economic policies just to allow some soldiers and the families to cultivate a little bit more vegetable, okay, and sell them in the market, okay, to make you a little bit more extra cash. And for that, he was criticized of being a capitalist or a capitalist ruler, and he recognized, he admitted that in this book. But Raul Castro came out to support him. Raul Castro said, what's the problem? I'm the godfather of all of these reforms. Okay. So that means, and he's ethnic Chinese. Okay. So, and his father was the owner of a small business before the revolution. Okay. All right. A couple more images. So, here is one of those restaurants run by, in the name of the Chinese Association. Okay, if you run a business personally, privately, that's fine if you are Chinese, ethnic Chinese. Okay, and if you do that in the name of a collectivity, that's even better. Okay, so that is, this one is run by Cuban Chinese Socialist Alliance. I showed that photo to you earlier. Okay. Now here is another Chinese restaurant. Okay, here is, so they display the images of those founding figures on the wall, okay, to show you their, honorary past. Here is Garcia. He and brought me to the restaurant, and she is the manager, okay, of the restaurant, and her father was a big figure in the community, but he passed away. Okay, now she is running, at least she's running, if not necessarily owning the business. Okay. And she cannot speak any Chinese. Okay. So here is another interesting case of Chinese business in Havana, a very rare case. Okay. She's a girl in Shanghai, and her father came to Cuba earlier to run a business, but she could not maintain that. And then she came and met him. So their marriage made the business a lot easier. Okay. So That restaurant is the best one in Havana. And guess who are the customers? The Chinese students. The Chinese students. I was in the restaurant a couple times. I was treating my, Cuban friends, and I saw Chinese students, not local, Cuban people. Okay. All right. So here is the a small portion of the old Chinatown, but it is called Chinatown today. Even if you go, online, very much you will be able to see these images. But that is really a small portion of old Chinatown. Okay. And the people just assume that is Chinatown. Okay. And the Chinese people just out there offering food. Okay. Now the last one. Okay. Let me play this first.
More than 1 century ago, hundreds of Chinese immigrants moved to Cuba. Their descendants have not only carried on the Chinese cultural heritage, but also blended it into the local culture. And now let's take a look at how passionate Cuban people interpret Chinese culture at the current 11th Chinese Cultural Festival in Havana.
As Chinese tradition goes, a big occasion is always kicked off with the lion dance, even on the other side of the globe. From ethnic dance to Tai Chi, from acrobatics to chorus, Chinese descendants and local Chinese art lovers presented a variety of programs at the opening ceremony.
My grandfather is a native of Guangdong province. He came to Cuba many years ago with other Chinese immigrants. Their Chinese cultural heritage has influenced the local culture and my works.
Sanchez's works are among the pieces displayed at the festival's exhibition featured with Chinese art. Also on display are some photos that have frozen in time some historic moments between Cuba and China. Some Cuban children have drawn their impression of China through an exhibition named Look at China. The 11th Chinese Culture Festival is sponsored by Cuban Ministry of Culture and the Chinese Embassy in Cuba. It's jointly held by Havana Exhibition Center, Havana Traditional Chinese Culture, and Confucius Institute of Havana University. Zhang Song, CCTV.
Okay, now, so I think that's the CCTV's perspective of Chinese in Cuba. So according to this type of description, Chinese culture and Chinese ethnicity has become a highly performative object. The community, but the question is, where is the community? The Chinese also had some, highly visible performance in the cultural display before 1959, but there was a very solid community. But behind this type of performance, there is almost, nothing but very little. So some American scholars began to worry about the there was the article published in Journal of Chinese Overseas last year, I think, in which the author raised the question of neo-Orientalism. Okay, thank you very much.